The glass in his hand was poisoned, and I was the one who had to clean the room where he was dying. 12 specialists couldn't save the most dangerous man on the East Coast. The woman who mopped their floors saw what they missed. Damian Blackwood, New York's most feared underworld tycoon. He was dying in his $5 million hospital suite at St. Michael's. Machines kept beeping. Experts kept frowning. Death kept edging closer. They said he controlled half the city from the shadows. They said even federal agencies hesitated to touch him. Yet there he lay, helpless against an enemy no one could name. Evelyn Sullivan, an invisible woman with a mop and a secret medical degree. She slipped into the room during the night shift, the way she'd learned to be unseen. Fewer eyes, fewer questions. She breathed in antiseptic, expensive cologne and something else. Something metallic, something wrong. Her medical-trained mind snapped to attention. She stopped cold, her fingers tightening around the mop handle. Her eyes tracked from his hands to his hairline to his slightly parted lips. The faint yellow tint at his fingernails, the specific, patchy pattern of hair loss, the subtle dark line along his gums. Her pulse kicked hard against her ribs. Thallium poisoning. The answer formed clean and clear, like glass under fluorescent light. She knew exactly what was killing him. But who would listen to a woman with a mop when 12 Ivy League specialists had already failed? And more importantly, who would believe the man everyone feared was being murdered by the one person he trusted most? Eve left the room, her steps heavy as if she were dragging stones. Her heart thrashed inside her chest. Each beat felt like an alarm no one else could hear. She knew the truth. She'd seen what 12 of the finest doctors in America had missed. But she didn't have the right to speak. She was just the one who mopped the floors. Eve pushed her cleaning cart down a dim corridor, the wheels squeaking in the silence. Her shadow stretched along the white wall, thin and faint like her own existence in this hospital. 5 years ago, she'd been somebody, a third-year medical student at Columbia, top of her class, a full scholarship, a future wide open. Then everything collapsed in a single night. Her parents, the accident, debts piling up like autumn leaves, dreams turning to ash. Now she was a ghost in a pale blue uniform, gliding through hallways no one bothered to see. They saw the mop. They never saw the person holding it. The phone in her pocket buzzed. Eve stopped and pulled it out. A message from Chloe lit up the screen. "Sis, have you paid this semester's tuition yet? I'm really worried." Eve stared at the words and swallowed hard. Chloe, 19 years old, a second-year engineering student at NYU, smart, hardworking, full of ambition, everything Eve had once been before life struck its cruel blow. Chloe was the reason she still got up every morning, the reason she endured exhausting night shifts, the reason she swallowed her pride when people looked right through her. "You won't have to drop out like I did, I promise." Eve typed quickly, "Don't worry, I've got it." She hit send even though her bank account was nearly empty, even though she knew she'd have to pick up 3 extra shifts this week, even though she knew she was lying to herself and lying to her little sister. But there were lies you told, because someone needed hope to keep going. Eve kept walking, but the image of Damian Blackwood wouldn't let go of her mind. Yellow nails, patchy hair loss, darkening gum lines, classic thallium presentation. He was being poisoned slowly, systematically, and no one saw it. But what would happen if she spoke up? A janitor daring to contradict 12 Harvard-educated experts. They'd laugh in her face. Worse, they'd fire her. And if she lost her job, Chloe would have to leave NYU. Her sister's dream would die the way Eve's dream had died. But if she stayed silent, a man would die. Whoever he was, whatever he'd done, he was still a human life. Was one life worth gambling her sister's future? Eve didn't know the answer. She pushed the cart into the staff restroom and locked the door. Facing the mirror, she looked at herself. 27, but she looked 35. Dark circles under eyes that were still a deep, clear blue. Skin pale from too little sunlight. Brown hair hastily tied back, yet those eyes still held a spark. Something that hadn't gone out, not completely. She thought of her parents, of what they'd taught her, of the person she'd wanted to become before life stole everything away. At the very least, she had to try. Eve drew a long, steady breath. She didn't know if anyone would listen. She didn't know if she'd lose her job, but she knew she couldn't watch someone fade toward death and do nothing. She stepped out of the restroom with her back a little straighter. She would find someone willing to listen, even if it was only one person, even if it cost her everything. Eve found Nicole Torres in the staff break room at 2 in the morning. The 32-year-old nurse sat with a cup of coffee, her black hair tied back neatly, her face drawn with fatigue after a long shift. Nicole was one of the few people at St. Michael who still offered Eve a smile. Maybe because they both worked nights. Maybe because Nicole understood what it felt like to be dismissed in a world ruled by men in white coats. Eve drew a deep breath and walked over. "Nurse Torres, I need to talk about the patient in the VIP suite, Mr. Blackwood." Nicole looked up, frowning. "What's going on?" Eve sat across from her, trying to keep her voice steady even as her heart pounded wildly. She began to explain the symptoms she'd observed. The distinctive yellowing of the nails, the pattern of hair loss that didn't match chemotherapy or autoimmune disease, the change along the gum line that followed a very specific progression. Everything pointed in one direction: thallium poisoning. At first, Nicole listened, her eyes widening with surprise. Then her expression shifted. Interest gave way to doubt. Doubt gave way to worry. "Eve, you mean well, but this is the doctor's job. 12 top specialists are on his case. They know what they're doing." "But they're not looking for the right thing," Eve said quickly. "Routine toxicology screens won't detect thallium. They need a specialized test. The symptoms are textbook if you know what to look for." Nicole set her coffee down. Her gaze turned so serious it was almost cold. "Eve, stop. You could get yourself into serious trouble if you keep saying things like this. You're cleaning staff, not a doctor. Know your place." Eve wanted to argue, wanted to shout that a diploma didn't decide who could see the truth. But she swallowed the words. She'd seen that look too many times. The look of someone who'd already shut the door and didn't want to hear another syllable. She stood, thanked Nicole in a hollow voice, and walked out. But she didn't give up. There was one more person she could try. Dr. James Chen, 29 years old, the youngest resident on the team assigned to Damian Blackwood. He seemed more approachable than the older physicians with their arrogant chins lifted toward the sky. Eve waited in the hallway near the on-call room. When Chen stepped out, she moved quickly to intercept him. "Dr. Chen, please, give me 1 minute." Chen stopped and looked at Eve's uniform with confusion. "What do you need?" Eve didn't waste time. She laid it out fast and clean, professional, deliberately using medical terms to prove she wasn't an outsider. She talked about peripheral neuropathy, about the alopecia pattern, about Me's lines on the nails, about gastrointestinal symptoms, all of it consistent with thallium poisoning. Chen listened in silence. His eyes changed from annoyance to curiosity, then to something that looked almost like respect. "Did you go to medical school?" 3 years at Columbia, before life happened." Silence stretched between them. Eve could see the struggle in Chen's face. He believed her. She knew he believed her. But then Chen shook his head and avoided her eyes. "I'm sorry. I can't recommend a test based on the opinion of cleaning staff. My career would be over if I'm wrong. Dr. Blake would never forgive me." "I understand," Eve cut in. She didn't want to hear another excuse. Didn't want to hear about careers and reputations and the things people treated as more valuable than a human life. She turned away before Chen could say anything else. Eve stood alone in the empty hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Her shadow stretched long across the cold tile floor. She swallowed her tears. The feeling wasn't new. Being ignored, being looked down on, being treated as if she didn't exist. For 5 years, she'd learned to live with it. But this time was different. This time, it wasn't about her. This time, a life was counting down second by second, and she couldn't do anything to stop it. Eve stared toward the VIP wing where the lights were dimmer, where Damien Blackwood lay, poison slowly tearing his body apart from the inside while no one noticed. She tried. She failed. Was there any other way? Then, without warning, the overhead speaker tore through the silence. Code Blue, VIP Suite 1, Code Blue. Eve's heart stopped for a beat. Then it hammered so hard she felt it might burst through her chest. Damien Blackwood was dying. Eve ran toward the VIP wing, leaving her cleaning cart abandoned in the middle of the hallway. The announcement still echoed inside her skull like a funeral bell. Code Blue, VIP Suite 1, cardiac arrest. Her legs moved faster than her thoughts. By the time she reached the doors, chaos had already erupted. Doctors and nurses rushed back and forth like a swarm struck from its hive. Machines screamed sharp and urgent, the rapid beeping like a dying heartbeat refusing to let go. The door to the suite stood wide open. Eve pressed into the crowd gathered outside, trying to see through the narrow gaps. Her chest tightened when she caught the scene inside. Damien Blackwood was seizing on the bed. His body jerked in violent waves as if electricity were ripping through him. His skin was so pale it looked almost bluish. His lips had turned dark with lack of oxygen. His eyes rolled back. Liver failure, a doctor shouted, eyes locked on the monitor. Kidneys are failing, severe neurological damage, we're losing him. Then a voice heavy, with authority cut through everything. Everyone move. Dr. Harrison Blake entered the room the way a general steps onto a battlefield. 58 years old, silver hair combed neatly into place, an expensive suit tailored to perfection. He was the department chief, a name Harvard was proud to list among its most distinguished alumni. When Blake spoke, the entire room fell silent. Report. A young doctor stammered through the numbers. Blake listened, his face cold as stone. Then he issued orders. Full toxicology panel. Check every possibility. Increase the stabilizing medications. Prepare dialysis in case the kidneys fail completely. Eve stood outside the doorway, her insides burning. A full toxicology panel sounded right, but she knew the truth. Routine tests would never catch thallium. They needed a specific assay. They needed to look for the right thing, but they didn't even know what they were looking for. 12 of the finest experts in America were fumbling in the dark, while the answer sat in plain sight, unseen. She couldn't stand there, couldn't watch a man die when she knew how to save him. Before she could think, before she could weigh the consequences, Eve stepped straight into the room. Dr. Blake. Her voice rang out in the middle of the chaos. Every movement stopped. Every gaze snapped toward her. A janitor in a pale blue uniform, standing in a room full of white coats and million-dollar equipment. A deadly silence. Please test for thallium, Eve said fast, knowing she had only seconds before they threw her out. The symptoms match completely. Yellow nails, the pattern of hair loss, peripheral nerve damage, multi-organ failure. This is classic thallium poisoning. Routine screening won't detect it. You need to order a specific test. The words poured out in one breath. Every scrap of medical knowledge she still carried rose to the surface. She hoped someone would listen. She hoped someone would see the truth. Instead of truth, she got anger. Blake's face reddened, shifting from surprise to irritation to fury. He strode toward Eve, his stare like a flame meant to burn her down. Who authorized cleaning staff to enter here? His voice was ice, weighted with power. Doctor, I only want to help. Silence, Blake snapped. Who do you think you are? Do you think you're smarter than properly trained specialists? You mop floors, you don't diagnose patients. He turned and barked, Security, get her out now. And I want the name of her supervisor. Someone like this shouldn't be working here. 2 security guards appeared as if the floor had opened beneath them. They grabbed Eve by the arms and dragged her out. She didn't fight. She didn't have the strength left to fight. All she felt was humiliation swallowing her cell by cell. As they hauled her through the doorway, Eve heard someone scoff inside the room. Now even the mop girl thinks she can diagnose patients. Shameful. A thin ripple of laughter followed, small but sharp enough to slice through what little pride she had left. Eve was shoved into the hallway and nearly stumbled. She stood there shaking, hands trembling, legs trembling, her whole body trembling with rage and shame. Nicole rushed over, her face drained white. Eve, are you insane? What did you just do? You nearly lost your job. You might have already lost it. Blake doesn't forgive. I was only trying to help, Eve whispered, her voice catching. Help, Nicole almost shouted. Help by staying quiet. That's your job. You clean, you mop. You don't interfere with the doctors. How many times do I have to tell you? Nicole turned away and hurried back into the suite. She was angry, too, at Eve's reckless stupidity. Eve sank onto a bench in the hallway, staring at her hands, still shaking. She tried everything. She tried to do the right thing, and she'd failed spectacularly. Inside the room, the machines began to steady. The shouting faded. It looked like they'd saved Damian Blackwood. This time. A nurse stepped out, breathing with relief. He's stable. We don't know the cause yet, but he's stable. Eve looked through the glass into the room. Damian Blackwood lay motionless on the bed, his skin still pale, but the convulsions had stopped. The ventilator rose and fell with measured rhythm. And on the table beside the bed, a jar of expensive-looking lotion sat gleaming under the lights, as if it were mocking her helplessness, mocking a voice no one cared to hear. Eve stared at the jar. Her anger cooled, but something else flared in its place. Determination. If no one would believe her, she'd have to find proof herself. Eve didn't get fired. Maybe the hospital was short on night shift staff. Maybe Nicole had spoken up for her. Maybe Blake had more important things to do than worry about a woman who mopped floors. Whatever the reason, Eve still had her job. And she was going to use it. No more trying to convince anyone. This time, she'd play it differently. Instead of talking, she would watch. Instead of begging people to believe her, she would find proof herself. Eve asked to change her schedule, volunteered for extra cleaning shifts in the VIP wing. The manager agreed immediately because no one wanted to work over there. Too many security guards, too many prying eyes, too many unsettling rumors about the mysterious patient in Suite 1. But to Eve, that was exactly where she needed to be. She started keeping notes, a small notebook hidden in the pocket of her uniform, recording everything. Who went into Damian's room, how long they stayed, what they carried, what they touched. Every small detail went onto the page with careful precision. When Damian slept, Eve watched him through the crack of the door, or while she cleaned inside the room. 36 years old. The angles of his face were sharp and striking, even as he lay weakened in a hospital bed. His black hair had begun to thin from the poison. Skin that had once been sun-browned now looked pale as paper. Yet there was still something about him that made people cautious, a kind of authority that didn't need to show itself, a quiet power even as his body fell apart. The nurses whispered when they thought no one could hear. They say he controls the docks and half the finance district. They say even the FBI won't touch him. Mafia on one side, legitimate empire on the other. People say he can make someone disappear with one phone call. Eve heard the rumors, but she didn't feel afraid. To her, Damien Blackwood wasn't some terrifying kingpin from whispered stories. He was a patient who was dying while no one could save him. A living, breathing human being poisoned by someone he trusted. And she was going to find out who. On the third day of watching, Eve found a lead. The door opened. A middle-aged man walked in with a friendly smile. 42, Eve guessed, trustworthy-looking, gentle face. A gray suit cut with quiet elegance. He carried a small paper bag. "Damien," he said, his voice warm, as if speaking to family. "I brought your favorite lotion, Swiss brand. You've got to keep your skin from getting too dry in this air." Eve was wiping down a table in the corner. She kept her head lowered, pretending to focus on her work, but her eyes never left the man. She watched every movement. The way he took the jar from the bag. The way he set it on the table beside the bed. Careful, precise. Making sure Damien would see it the moment he turned his head. Marcus Rossi. She heard a nurse say his name in the hallway as she greeted him. Damien Blackwood's right hand, his closest friend, the person he trusted most. Over the next days, Eve watched more closely. Marcus came every day. He never missed one. He always brought a fresh jar of lotion. He always placed it where it would be seen first. And there was one more thing that made Eve's skin prickle. The way Marcus looked at Damien when Damien slept. It wasn't the worried gaze of a friend, not the grief of someone watching a loved one fade. It was a look of waiting, patient, cold, like a hunter sitting in the dark, waiting for prey to finally drop. Eve had seen that look before, in documentaries about murderers, in shows where criminal psychologists broke down a killer's mind. It was the look of someone who already knew the ending and was counting down the days. She began tracking the position of the lotion jar. Each day it was placed a little differently, sometimes closer, sometimes rotated so the label faced Damien. Someone was making sure Damien would use it often. And the only person who brought the lotion, the only person who always touched that jar, was Marcus Rossi. Eve was wiping a hallway window when she heard footsteps behind her. She didn't turn, kept cleaning, but her ears sharpened. Marcus Rossi stepped out of Damien's room. A phone pressed to his ear, his voice dropped. Nothing like the warmth he used with Damien. It was cold, calculating. About 2 more weeks at this rate. No one suspects. Those stupid doctors are still looking in the wrong direction. When he dies, everything will be ours. I've waited 15 years for this chance. Nothing will go wrong. Eve froze. The cloth in her hand went rigid in midair. Her heart seemed to stop. What had she just heard? Had she just heard a murderer confess? When he dies, everything will be ours. The words kept echoing in Eve's head like a death knell. She'd heard every word clearly, every syllable, every cold breath threaded through Marcus Rossi's voice. 15 years of waiting. No one suspects. 2 more weeks. Eve's hand started to tremble. The shaking began at her fingertips, climbed into her arms, spread through her whole body. She tried to grip the cleaning cloth, but her fingers wouldn't obey. The cloth slipped free and dropped to the floor. The soft thump landed in the silent hallway like a gunshot. Eve went rigid. The footsteps behind her stopped. The phone call cut off. Then came the sound of leather shoes turning on tile. Eve felt the stare drilling into the back of her neck before she even turned around. "Did you hear anything?" Marcus's voice came again, no longer warm the way it had been with Damien. Cold, sharp, like a blade laid against her throat. Eve bent to pick up the cloth, fighting to control her shaking hands. When she straightened, she forced a smile onto her lips. "Sir, no, sir, I was just cleaning." Her voice quivered. She knew. Marcus knew too. The friendly mask had fallen away completely. The gentle face vanished. The man standing in front of Eve now was someone else entirely. Eyes hard as knives, jaw clenched, muscles in his face pulled tight. This was Marcus Rossi's real face. The face of a man quietly killing his closest friend. He stepped toward Eve. Each footfall sounded like a countdown. 1, 2, 3. Eve wanted to run, but her feet felt nailed to the floor. She wanted to scream, but her throat locked up. All she could do was stand there and watch a killer close the distance. One step at a time. Marcus stopped right in front of her, close enough that she could smell the expensive cologne on him, close enough to see the cords in his neck standing out with tension. He looked her up and down. His gaze lingered on the pale blue uniform, on the hands holding a rag, on the worn, flat shoes. "You're the one who mops floors." "Yes, sir," Eve said, her mouth gone dry. Silence stretched. Eve didn't dare breathe, didn't dare blink, didn't dare move. She could feel him studying her, weighing her, deciding how dangerous she was, deciding whether she was worth worrying about. Then Marcus laughed, a cold sound that rang through the empty hallway. There wasn't a trace of humor in it, only contempt and a warning that didn't need to be spoken aloud. "Good, you're just the one who mops floors. You probably don't understand the complicated conversations people like us have. Business talk." He lifted a hand and patted Eve's shoulder. The gesture looked friendly, the way you'd pat a coworker, but Eve felt the weight in that hand, the weight of a threat, the weight of death if she opened her mouth. "Keep doing your job," Marcus said, his tone gentle, but each word felt like a nail being driven into Eve's skull. "And remember, don't listen to what you shouldn't. Sometimes curiosity can lead to unfortunate accidents." He held her gaze for one more second, eyes sharp, as if carving her face into memory. Then he turned away and walked toward the elevator, back straight, confidence effortless, as if what had just happened were nothing more than forgettable small talk. Eve stayed there until she heard the elevator doors close, until his footsteps vanished completely. Then she sagged against the wall, her knees giving out. Her heart hammered like a drum. Cold sweat ran down her spine, soaking into her uniform. Her hands shook so badly she couldn't even hold the cloth. He was doing it. He was killing Damian Blackwood, the closest friend, the most trusted one. And she had just become a dangerous witness. Eve looked toward VIP Suite 1. Through the glass, she could see Damian propped against his pillows. In his hand was the jar of lotion. He was rubbing it into his skin. Slowly, carefully, layer by layer, every motion pressing poison deeper into his pores, into his blood, into every cell. He was killing himself with his own hands. And he had no idea. Eve swallowed hard. She couldn't tell anyone. No one would believe her. She tried and she'd failed. But she couldn't stay silent either. She couldn't watch someone die right in front of her. "I've got to do something," Eve told herself. Right now, before it's too late. Eve made it back to their small apartment in Queens just before 6 in the morning. Chloe had already left for her early classes at NYU, a note waiting on the kitchen table. "Remember to eat breakfast. Love you." Eve stared at her sister's messy handwriting and something tightened in her chest. She lay down on the bed, but sleep wouldn't come. The dull white ceiling stared back at her like it was passing judgment. The image of Damian Blackwood rubbing lotion into his hands kept looping through her mind. Every motion, every layer, every second the poison sank deeper into his skin, and Marcus Rossi's eyes, cold, threatening. "Don't listen to what you shouldn't listen to." Eve turned onto her side and squeezed her eyes shut, trying to force herself to sleep. But every time she closed them, she saw Damian's pallid face again, heard the monitor screaming, felt death creeping closer day by day. She tried to warn them. She, tried everything, and she'd failed. No one believed a woman who mopped floors. But they'd have to believe science. If I have hard proof, they'll have to listen. Eve sat up and grabbed the old laptop from the table. She started searching. Private lab, toxicology testing, anonymous submissions. After nearly an hour, she found one in the suburbs of Long Island. They accepted samples from anyone. No physician referral required. No identity needed. $500, results in 72 hours. Eve stared at the number on the screen and felt her stomach drop. $500. Almost everything she'd saved. Money she'd scraped together dollar by dollar for 2 years. Money meant for emergencies. Money meant for Chloe if something ever happened. Her gaze drifted to the photo of her sister on the nightstand. Chloe at 19, smiling bright on her first day of college. A future wide open. A dream still intact. If I get caught, who's going to take care of her? The question drilled into Eve's mind like a bit into bone. She was weighing the idea of sneaking into a VIP patient's room and stealing a sample. That was a crime. She could get fired. She could be charged. She could go to prison. And if that happened, Chloe would have to drop out. Her dream would dissolve into smoke the way Eve's had 5 years ago. But if Eve stayed quiet, a man would die. Die because she was afraid. Die because she didn't act. Eve closed her eyes and took a slow, steady breath. Then she made her decision. That evening, before she went to work, Eve stopped by the hospital's medical waste area. She found what she needed in the piles of discarded supplies. A plastic syringe still sealed in its packaging, tossed out because it was past its expiration date, but still perfectly clean. She slipped it into her uniform pocket, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. The plan was simple. 3 in the morning was when the fewest people were around. Most doctors and nurses would be resting or dealing with emergencies elsewhere. She'd go into Damien's room on the pretext of cleaning, take a small sample from the lotion jar, then leave as if nothing had happened. 2:55 in the morning. Eve rolled her cleaning cart into the VIP wing, her heart beating so wildly she felt sure anyone could hear it. Each footstep echoed in the empty corridor. Each squeak of the wheels sounded like an alarm. Derek Sullivan stood guard outside Suite 1, 34, broad-shouldered, face hard as stone. He was Damien Blackwood's private security, the only one allowed to stay overnight. "Cleaning the room at this hour?" Derek asked, his sharp eyes scanning Eve from head to toe. "Yes, sir. It's on tonight's schedule," Eve said, fighting to keep her voice normal. She hoped he couldn't hear her heartbeat thundering in her chest. Derek studied her for a few more seconds, then nodded. "Make it quick. My boss needs rest." Eve pushed the cart into the room, forcing her hands not to shake. The lights had been turned down to their lowest setting. The ventilator made a steady sound in the darkness. Damien Blackwood lay on the bed with his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in an even rhythm. She moved to the bedside table. The jar of lotion sat there, gleaming under the dim light as if it had been waiting for her. Eve pulled the syringe from her pocket, her hands trembling so badly she nearly dropped it. She opened the jar, careful not to make a sound. Just a little, just a little. She told herself, sliding the tip of the syringe into the cream. Her heart hammered like it was about to explode. Cold sweat broke across her forehead. If she got caught, she'd go to prison. What would happen to Chloe? Mom and Dad are gone, and now you'd leave her too. Her hand slipped. The jar knocked against the tabletop, making a small click, loud and clear in the silent room. Eve froze. "What are you doing?" A cold voice tore through the dark. Eve turned, blood turning to ice in her veins. Damien Blackwood was awake. His gray eyes were open, fixed on her, sharp as a blade. dangerous as a predator that had just caught prey trespassing on its territory. Eve stood frozen, statue still. The jar was still in her hand. The syringe was still in her pocket, and Damien Blackwood's gray eyes were drilling through her like lasers. Even flat on a hospital bed, even with his body weakened by poison, he carried an authority that made it hard for Eve to breathe. This was the man the FBI supposedly treated with caution. The underworld tycoon who controlled half of New York from the shadows. And she'd just been caught red-handed, rummaging through his things. "Answer me," Damien said, his voice low but heavy with power. "What are you doing with that?" Eve could have lied, could have made up a story about cleaning, about sanitation checks, could have begged for forgiveness and promised she'd never come back, could have bolted for the door and prayed Derek wouldn't catch her. But looking into those gray eyes, she knew a lie would be suicide. A man didn't survive in the underworld for 20 years because he was easy to fool. He could read dishonesty in the way someone breathed. And if she lied, she wouldn't walk out of this room. Eve drew a deep breath. Then she told the truth. "I think you're being poisoned. Thallium, in this jar of lotion." Silence. Damien didn't shout. He didn't call security. He didn't explode with anger or panic. He only looked at her. Looked so long Eve wanted to look away. Looked like he was dissecting every word, every flicker of her face, every breath she took. "Who are you?" "Evelyn Sullivan, night shift cleaning staff." "Cleaning staff," Damien repeated, his tone unreadable. "And you think you know more than specialists." Eve swallowed hard, but she didn't step back. "I used to be in medical school, 3rd year at Columbia, before everything changed." For the first time, something else flashed in Damien's eyes. Curiosity. "What happened?" Eve hesitated. She didn't want to tell him, didn't want to reopen an old wound for a stranger, especially a dangerous stranger like Damien Blackwood. But he'd asked, and she needed him to believe her. "My parents died in a car accident," Eve said, her voice dropping. 5 years ago, a drunk driver hit them. They died on the scene. And they left behind $200,000 in debt I didn't even know existed, along with a 14-year-old sister who needed someone to take care of her. You dropped out to raise her." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. Damien had understood the story before she finished telling it. "I didn't have a choice," Eve said. Silence stretched between them. Damien looked at her differently now, not the stare he'd given an intruder, not the look of an underworld kingpin sizing up prey, but the look of a man seeing something unexpected, something interesting. "You gave up everything for someone else," Damien said slowly. "Would you have done differently?" Eve shot back without thinking. "Would you?" The question made Damien go still. Something passed through his eyes. Maybe a memory, maybe regret, maybe the realization that he'd never had anyone to sacrifice himself for, and no one had ever sacrificed themselves for him. "Why do you care if I live?" Damien asked after a long moment. "You know who I am, you know what people say about me, and you still want to save me." "I know what people say," Eve answered honestly. "But I also know what I've seen. I see a man being poisoned by the person he trusts most. I see 12 of the best doctors in America chasing the wrong thing while you die a little more every day. And I see a truth no one will accept because the one saying it is just a woman who mops floors." "You still haven't answered the question. Why do you care?" Eve held his gaze straight into the gray eyes that kept boring into her. "Because no one else is willing to see the truth, and because no one deserves to be betrayed by the person they trust, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done. Betrayal is the worst thing in this world." Something strange flickered across Damien's face. Maybe recognition, maybe respect. Maybe for the first time in a long time, someone was speaking to him like a human being instead of a terrifying boss or a walking bag of money. "You're not afraid of me?" Damien asked, his voice a shade lighter. "I am," Eve admitted. "I'm terrified, but fear never stopped me from doing what's right. If it could, I would have quit 5 years ago." Damien was quiet for a long time. His gray eyes never left her. Eve could feel him making a decision, one that could change her life or end it. Then Damien said, low and final, "Take the sample." Eve blinked, not sure she'd heard him correctly. "What?" "Take the lotion sample," Damien repeated. "Send it for testing. If you're right, I owe you my life. And if you're wrong—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the cold gray in his stare told Eve enough. If she was wrong, she would pay. She nodded without another word. With hands that no longer shook, Eve drew the sample into the syringe. This time, Damien didn't stop her. He only lay there, watching with eyes she couldn't read. As Eve turned to leave, Damien's voice came after her. "Evelyn Sullivan." She paused and looked back. "I'll remember your name." Eve didn't know if it was a promise or a threat. Maybe it was both. The next morning, Eve went to the private lab in Long Island as soon as they opened. She handed the syringe of lotion to the intake clerk, filled out the anonymous form, and paid $500 in cash, nearly all her savings. "Results in 72 hours, the clerk said, sliding an appointment slip across the counter. "We'll text you when they're ready." Eve stared down at the slip in her hand. 72 hours. 3 days. 3 days to learn whether she was right or wrong. 3 days for Damien Blackwood to keep living or keep dying. It might be too long. The first day passed like a nightmare that wouldn't end. Eve went to work as usual, but she couldn't focus. Every time she pushed her cart through the VIP wing, she glanced through the glass into Damien's room. The jar of lotion was still on the table in the same spot. But Eve noticed something. Damien wasn't using it anymore. The lid wasn't being opened. There were no new fingerprints on the cap, no sheen of cream on his hands or forearms. "He listened to me." Eve thought, her heart easing just a little. At least he wasn't poisoning himself while they waited for the results. She didn't know that from his hospital bed, Damien was watching her, too. Those gray eyes tracked her through the glass each time she passed, watching the way she worked, the way she lowered her head to avoid other people's eyes, the way she moved through the corridor like a ghost no one bothered to see. "Derek," Damien called his bodyguard into the room. "Find out about that girl, everything." "Yes, boss." That night, Derek came back with a thin file. Evelyn Sullivan, 27, dropped out of medical school in her 3rd year 5 years ago after her parents died in a traffic accident. Currently supporting a 19-year-old sister in college. Works 2 jobs. Nights here, afternoons at a laundromat in Queens. No debt. No criminal record. No ties to any suspicious organization or individual. "She has no motive?" Damien asked, frowning. "No, boss," Derek said, shaking his head. "She's clean. Clean enough it's hard to believe. I couldn't find any reason for her to approach you beyond what she told you." Damien fell quiet for a long moment, looking out through the glass. Eve was wiping down a hallway window, her back to him, unaware she was being watched. "She doesn't look at me the way others do," Damien said, thoughtful. "Not with fear, not with greed, not with calculation. She looks at me like I'm just a patient who needs saving." Derek didn't know what to say. He'd never heard his boss talk about anyone like that. On the second day, Marcus Rossi visited as usual. He walked in with a warm smile and a fresh jar of lotion in his hand. "Damien, you didn't use the lotion I brought yesterday," Marcus asked, setting the new jar on the table. "I can see it's untouched." "My skin's irritated," Damien said evenly, his voice not shifting at all. "The doctor told me to stop using all skin care products during treatment." "But this is the only one that doesn't cause irritation," Marcus pressed, his tone still gentle, but edged with something more urgent than usual. "You've used it for years. You've never had a problem. Try again. Your skin's too dry." "I said no, Marcus." Damien cut him off, his voice a shade colder. After Marcus left, Damien lay staring at the ceiling, thinking. He was too insistent. Why did he care so much whether I used the lotion or not? The question drilled into his mind like a bit into bone. Late on the second night, Eve came in to clean as usual. Damien wasn't asleep. He was propped against his pillows, watching her as she entered. "You sent the sample." Eve nodded, wiping down the table. "Yes, 24 more hours." "And if you're wrong?" Eve stopped and looked at Damien. Her eyes were calm, but her voice was firm. "Then I'll apologize and disappear from your life. You'll never see me again." "And if you're right?" "Then you owe me your life," Eve said, a small smile appearing for the first time since they'd met. Damien watched that smile, small, tired, but real. "You're brave," he said, "or crazy." "Maybe both," Eve replied, going back to work. "Maybe you have to be crazy to sneak into an underworld tycoon's room at 3 in the morning to steal a lotion sample." Damien almost smiled. Almost. "You're the strangest person I've ever met, Evelyn Sullivan." The third day. Eve stood at the bus stop waiting to go to her afternoon shift at the laundromat. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and looked at the screen. A text from the lab. "Your test results are ready. Please come to the intake counter to receive them." Eve's hands began to shake. Her heart slammed against her ribs. The moment of truth had arrived. Eve skipped her shift at the laundromat. She took the first bus to the lab, her heart pounding the entire way. When she reached the intake counter, she had to take several deep breaths just to steady herself. This was the deciding moment. This was when she'd find out whether she was right or wrong. This was when she'd learn whether she was about to save a life or lose everything because of a reckless assumption. The clerk checked the code on her receipt, then disappeared into the back and returned with a white envelope. "Here are your results." Eve took the envelope with shaking hands. She opened it and slid the paper out. Her eyes raced down the lines, the lab's name, the test date, sample type, skin lotion, the analysis method. Then the results section. Detected, thallium sulfate. Concentration, high. Hazard level, acute toxicity. Eve had to read it again. Then again, black letters on white paper, clear, unmistakable. Thallium sulfate, high concentration, hazard level. "Oh my God," Eve whispered, tears spilling over. "I was right, I was really right." She wanted to cry, wanted to laugh, wanted to scream right there in a waiting room full of strangers. After so many days of being ignored, dismissed, treated like she didn't exist. After so many nights of wondering if she was losing her mind. And now the paper in her hands proved it. She was right. She'd been right from the start. But there was no time to celebrate. Damien Blackwood was still dying in the hospital. Even if he'd stopped using the lotion, the thallium that had built up in his body for weeks was still chewing him up from the inside. Liver, kidneys, nervous system. Every hour that passed was another hour the poison kept doing its work. Eve checked the time, 7 in the evening. Her hospital shift didn't start until 10, but she couldn't wait that long. She had to get these results to Damien right now. That night, Eve arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. She wasn't pushing a cleaning cart. She wasn't fully in uniform. It was just her in everyday clothes, the lab report clenched tight in her hand. Derek Sullivan stood guard outside Suite 1 as always. When he saw Eve coming, he stepped forward to block her. "You can't go in. It's not your shift yet." "I need to see Mr. Blackwood," Eve said, her voice harder than usual. "Right now." Derek frowned, about to refuse. But from inside the room, Damien's voice carried out. "Let her in." Derek looked inside, startled, then reluctantly moved aside. Eve passed him and stepped into the dim room. Damien sat propped against his pillows, gray eyes fixed on her without blinking. He'd been waiting. He knew she'd come. Eve didn't speak. She walked to the bedside and set the results on the table directly in front of Damien. Then she stepped back and waited. Damien picked up the paper. His gray eyes moved line by line. 1 minute passed. Then 2. The air in the room thickened until Eve felt she could cut it with a knife. She watched Damien's face, trying to read his reaction, but there was nothing there. That face was stone. No expression. No emotion. As if he were reading a dull business report instead of proof that the person closest to him was killing him. Then Eve looked into his eyes. And she saw everything. The gray flared to life. Not the hot blaze of sudden anger, but a cold fire. The fire of betrayal. The fire of 15 years of trust driven into his back like a knife. The fire of a deep, private pain that only someone who has loved can feel when the one they trusted most tries to destroy them. A single word slipped from Damien's lips, cold as ice. "Marcus." Eve stood perfectly still, not daring to move. She was witnessing something dangerous, something more frightening than rage, the calm of a man who had made a decision. Damien pressed the call button by his bed. Derek appeared immediately. "Get Dr. Blake in here," Damien said, his voice so even it was terrifying. "Now." It was an order, not a request. Derek nodded and vanished. Damien turned back to Eve. The gray in his eyes softened slightly when he looked at her. "You saved my life, Evelyn Sullivan," he said low and slow. "In my world, that's a debt that can't ever be repaid." 15 minutes later, Dr. Harrison Blake strode into Suite 1 with irritation written all over his face. He'd been dragged out of sleep in the middle of the night by a call from the patient's bodyguard, and it clearly didn't sit well with him. "Mr. Blackwood, what emergency could possibly be so urgent it can't wait until morning?" Blake asked, his tone trying for politeness, but unable to hide the annoyance underneath. Damien didn't answer. He simply held out the lab report toward Blake. "Explain." Blake took the paper, frowning. Then he started to read. Eve stood in the corner of the room, watching the Harvard chief's face change second by second. From annoyance to confusion. From confusion to surprise. From surprise to alarm. And finally to a pallor like death. "Thallium," Blake stammered, eyes still glued to the page as if he couldn't trust what he was seeing. "But we ran a full toxicology panel. There's no way we could have missed it." "You and your 12 specialists missed it," Damien said, his voice cold as ice. "A private lab found it in 72 hours. Blake looked up, flushing red, then going pale, then red again. His gaze darted around the room as if hunting for someone to blame. "Who ordered this test? Who dared send a sample out without my authorization?" Damien pointed toward Eve, standing still in the shadowed corner. "The one you threw out of the room a few days ago." Blake turned to look at Eve. His eyes widened when he registered the street clothes instead of the pale blue uniform. When he realized she was the same cleaning worker who dared to storm into the emergency seen the other night. "Her," Blake choked. "She's just the one who mops floors." Damien cut in, each word like a knife. "Yes, and she saw what you and your 12 Harvard experts couldn't. She saw I was being poisoned while you chased illnesses that don't exist." Blake stood there as if lightning had struck him. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. "Prussian blue," Damien ordered, his voice allowing no argument. "Start it now. I don't care about protocol or procedure." Blake hurried to summon a nurse. Minutes later, a medical team rushed in with the antidote. Eve watched them prepare the Prussian blue infusion for Damien, relief loosening her chest even while tension still held her tight. Damien was being saved. But what about the one who'd poisoned him? As if he'd read her mind, Damien turned to Derek, who was standing by the door. "Bring Marcus Rossi here." Damien's tone was as calm as if he were inviting someone to a party. Polite, but final. "Yes, boss." Derek disappeared out the door. Eve heard the word bring and understood. Damien wasn't calling the police. He had his own way of dealing with betrayal. 30 minutes crawled by in tight, waiting silence. Blake left after the antidote was underway, his face ashen with humiliation. The nurses withdrew as well. Soon only Eve and Damien remained in the dim room, waiting. Then the door opened. Marcus Rossi walked in, still wearing that familiar warm smile. "Damien, I heard you needed me urgently. What's going on? Are you okay?" The smile died the moment Marcus saw the lab report on the table. The moment his eyes found the bold words thallium sulfate printed on white paper. 15 years, Marcus," Damien said, his voice so calm it raised the hair on Eve's arms. 15 years I trusted you, treated you like family, gave you everything, and you repay me like this." Marcus froze for a few seconds. Then he forced himself back into composure, spreading a brittle smile. "Damien, I don't understand what you're talking about. This has to be some kind of mistake." "Thallium," Damien went on as if he hadn't heard the denial. "In the lotion you brought me every day. The Swiss brand you insisted I use. The one you kept replacing even when I hadn't finished the last jar." The friendly mask on Marcus's face fell away completely. Panic flashed in his eyes, then hardened into anger, then sharpened into hatred. "You don't deserve this empire," Marcus exploded, his voice rising into a shriek like an animal cornered. "You're too soft, too hesitant, too many rules. I built half of what you have. I sacrificed 15 years of my life serving you, and you don't even know how to use what you've been given." Damien didn't shout back. He didn't rage. He didn't stand. He only sat there staring at Marcus with eyes cold as ice. Then he said 3 words, and nothing more. "Take him." The door opened. Derek stepped in with 2 thick-built men. They grabbed Marcus and dragged him toward the door. "You'll regret this," Marcus thrashed, screaming like a madman. "You think you can survive without me? You'll die, Yule." The door shut, cutting off the shriek. Silence poured back into the room. Eve stood in the corner, legs trembling. She just witnessed something she knew she was never meant to see. For the first time, she saw who Damien Blackwood really was. Not a weak patient in a hospital bed. A man who could end a life with 3 words. Part of her was afraid. But another part understood. He'd been betrayed by the person closest to him, the way life had betrayed her, the way she'd lost her parents, her future, everything through no fault of her own. Damien turned to Eve. His gray eyes pierced her as if he were reading every thought in her head. "You've seen too much tonight," he said low and slow. "Normally, I don't let witnesses live." Eve's heart slammed. She wanted to run, but her legs wouldn't move. But Damien continued, his voice softening just a little. "Lucky for you, I'm not normal." The room fell into silence after the door closed. Marcus's scream still seemed to hang in the air, like the echo of an era that had just ended. 15 years of trust. 15 years of friendship turned to ash in a single night. Eve stood in the corner, not knowing what to do. She witnessed far too much for a woman who mopped floors. Betrayal, fury, the absolute power of an underworld kingpin. And now, she was alone with that man in a dim room. "I should go," Eve said, her voice small as if she were afraid to crack the fragile quiet. "Stay." Damien's voice wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Eve stopped, her heart tightening. She turned to face the gray eyes that didn't blink. Damien sat propped against his pillows, the Prussian blue infusion still running into his arm. He looked exhausted, but alert down to the last second. "What do you want?" Damien asked bluntly with no detours. "What repayment?" He said it like he was discussing a business deal. "You saved my life. In my world, that's not small, so tell me. What do you want? Money, any amount, a house? I can buy you a penthouse tomorrow, a better job. One phone call and you'll have a position in any company you want." Eve looked at him and felt something strange rise inside her. Not anger, not offense, sadness. Sadness because this was probably the only way Damien Blackwood knew how to deal with people. Buy them, pay them, turn every relationship into a transaction. "I didn't save you to be repaid," Eve said, calm but unshakable. Damien blinked. For the first time since she'd met him, Eve saw real surprise on his face. Maybe it was the first time anyone had ever told him no without fear or calculation behind it. "Then why?" Damien asked, his voice a little softer. "Why did you do all of this? Risk your job, risk your freedom, risk even your life for a stranger, for me?" Eve held his gaze. "Because it was the right thing to do, and because no one deserves to be betrayed by the person they trust. No one, no matter who they are, no matter what they've done." Damien watched her for a long time, gray eyes digging as if they could reach straight into her soul. Then he said low and slow, "You're not talking about me. You're talking about you." Eve went quiet. He'd seen her. Seen the pain she'd hidden for 5 years. Seen the wound that had never healed. "Who betrayed you, Evelyn?" "My life did," Eve said, her voice catching even as she tried to hold it steady. "The universe, fate, something that took my parents in a single night, took my future, took everything I ever dreamed of. No reason, no warning, no chance to say goodbye." "But you're still here." "Because I have a sister to take care of," Eve said simply. "Chloe is 19. She's in college. She's everything I have left, and I won't let her lose her future the way I lost mine." Damien stayed silent for a long time. His eyes had changed. They weren't ice anymore. They weren't blades anymore. There was something warmer there. Softer, more human. "You know, before Marcus, I never truly trusted anyone," Damien said, as if he were speaking to himself more than to her. "I built this empire on suspicion, on never turning my back on anyone. And then I met Marcus. I thought I'd found an exception. 15 years. 15 years I believed in him, and look how that ended." He paused and stared into the black window. "After tonight, I don't think I'll ever trust anyone again." "But," Eve asked quietly. "But you're different," Damien said, turning back to her, eyes searching for something. "You have no motive, no money, no power, no connections. You're just a woman who mops floors and wants to do what's right. And that makes you the strangest person I've ever met." "You're going back to school," Damien said, his voice turning sharp with decision. "Medicine, any school you want, Harvard, Johns Hopkins, Stanford, tuition, living expenses, books, all of it. I'll take care of it." Eve shook her head immediately. "I can't accept." "This isn't charity," Damien cut in. "This is me paying a debt, and I don't like owing anyone. You saved my life. What's my life worth? More than a scholarship, that's for sure, but I'll set up a scholarship fund." Damien went on as if she hadn't spoken. "Completely legal. No one will know where the money came from. No one will know the connection between you and me. You'll be the first recipient, and you will take it, not a request." Eve stared at him, torn in two. For 5 years, she'd refused help. For 5 years, she'd clawed her way through everything alone. But this was a chance to change it all. A chance to finish the dream she'd been forced to abandon. A chance to stop Chloe from worrying about her sister's tuition ever again. "For Chloe," Eve said after a long moment, "I'll do anything for her." "I know," Damien said with a small nod, as if it was the answer he'd been waiting for. Then he did something that made Eve freeze. Damien reached out and took her hand. Not a polite handshake, not a calculated gesture, something real. Maybe the first real thing he'd done in years. "You deserve to be seen, Evelyn Sullivan," Damien said, his voice low and warm. "Don't ever forget that." Eve looked down at his hand holding hers, looked into gray eyes that weren't cold anymore, and for the first time in 5 years, she felt like she existed. The news spread through St. Michael's Hospital like a wildfire. A woman who mopped floors saved a VIP patient. An invisible woman spotted what 12 Harvard specialists had missed. The story grew with every shift change, every break room whisper, every hallway corner. Wherever Eve went, she could feel the eyes on her, not the glance that slid past as if she didn't exist. These were eyes filled with curiosity, surprise, respect. Nurses murmured when she walked by. Doctors nodded hello instead of ignoring her. She wasn't invisible anymore. Now everyone could see her. That afternoon, Dr. Harrison Blake found her in the hallway. He stood in front of her with a posture that looked nothing like his old arrogance. Shoulders slightly rounded, eyes refusing to meet hers. "Ms. Sullivan," Blake began, his words coming out heavy, as if each one weighed a pound. "I want to tell you that I was wrong. I underestimated you. That was a serious mistake on my part." Eve looked at him, the man who'd thrown her out of the emergency room in front of everyone. The man who'd called security to drag her away like an intruder. The man who'd humiliated her so deeply she'd wanted to disappear into the floor. But she didn't feel hatred. She didn't feel bitterness, only exhaustion, and the urge to keep moving forward. "Thank you, doctor," Eve said with a small nod. Then she turned and kept pushing her cleaning cart. No more words were needed. Nicole Torres came running to find her in the staff lounge. The nurse wrapped Eve in a tight hug and sobbed into her shoulder. "I'm sorry," Nicole cried between gulps of air. "I should have believed you. You tried to tell me and I didn't listen. I'm truly sorry." "You spoke up so I could keep my job that day," Eve said, patting Nicole's back. "That's enough." "You're going to be a great doctor, Eve," Nicole said, wiping her tears and looking at her with fierce faith. "I know it. I've always known it." Damien Blackwood recovered quickly. Prussian blue did its work, binding the thallium inside his body. His numbers slowly stabilized. His skin lost some of its ghostly pallor. His strength began to return. In theory, he could have been discharged at any time. But he didn't leave. "Boss, your body's stable," Derek asked one day. "Why aren't you going home?" Damien didn't answer. He only looked out through the glass to where Eve was pushing her cart down the hallway. That night, Eve went into Damien's room the way she always did, but this time he was sitting up reading instead of sleeping. "You don't need to clean my room anymore," Damien said, without looking up from his book. "I know," Eve said, still wiping down the table, "but I want to." Damien set the book aside and looked at her. Something soft flickered in the gray eyes that were usually made of ice. They talked about life, about the past, about the future. Damien told her about a childhood he'd never told anyone, leaving home at 16 with nothing but his own hands, building everything from zero, learning not to trust anyone just to survive, until he met Marcus and thought he'd finally found an exception. "You're the first person who ever saw me as a patient," Damien said, his voice low. "Not a monster, not a wallet, not a terrifying boss, just a man who needed saving." "And you're the first person who ever saw me as a human being," Eve said. "Not a ghost, not someone invisible, not the one who mops floors, just a woman who matters." At the end of her shift, Eve checked her phone. A new email from Harvard Medical School. She opened it, her heart going wild. An acceptance letter. A full scholarship, tuition, living expenses, and a monthly stipend included, funded by the Blackwood Foundation for Medical Excellence. Eve looked toward VIP Suite 1, tears streaming down her cheeks. He'd really done it, just like he'd promised. Her phone buzzed. Chloe was calling. "Sis," Chloe's voice shook with joy. Harvard just called me. They said you got a full scholarship. You're going to be a doctor. Sis, Mom and Dad would be so proud of you. Eve cried from happiness, cried from grief, cried from everything she'd carried for 5 years, the sleepless nights, the skipped meals, the times she'd been belittled, the tears she'd swallowed back. And now the dream from 5 years ago, the dream she'd thought was dead, was finally going to come true. Eve stood in front of the small locker in the staff room, looking at the few things she'd gathered over the last 5 years. An old jacket, a handful of medical textbooks borrowed from the library, a family photo taken before her parents died. 5 years, 1,825 days, countless sleepless nights, countless times being looked down on, countless tears swallowed in silence. Now it would all end. Nicole Torres walked in holding a framed photograph, sealed carefully behind glass. It was the night shift staff at last year's Christmas party, with Eve standing in the farthest corner, almost blending into the wall. "Don't forget us, future doctor," Nicole said, pulling Eve into a tight hug. "I'm going to keep an eye on you, and I'm going to tell everyone I ever worked with Dr. Evelyn Sullivan." Eve smiled and took the picture. She wouldn't forget. She'd never forget the place where she'd been a ghost. Dr. James Chen appeared in the doorway, his expression awkward. "Ms. Sullivan," he said, his voice nothing like the distant one he'd used before. "I want to apologize for that day, for not listening to you." Eve looked at him, the young doctor who'd turned her away because he was afraid for his career. She wasn't angry. She understood. "What's the lesson?" Eve asked. "Listen," Chen said, his eyes sincere. "Not just with your ears, but with your heart. You taught me that." On Eve's last day at St. Michael's, she was getting ready to leave when she saw a familiar figure waiting in the lobby. Damian Blackwood in a perfectly tailored black suit, looking far healthier than the last time she'd seen him on the hospital bed. His gray eyes were still sharp as knives, but when he looked at her, they softened slightly. "You ready for Harvard?" Damian asked when she walked up. "I don't know," Eve said honestly, "but I'll do my best." "You'll succeed," Damian said, his voice firm like it was an obvious fact. "How are you so sure?" "Because you never quit," Damian said, meeting her eyes. "Even when the whole world didn't believe you, even when you were dismissed, ignored, thrown out, you kept going. Someone like that can't fail." Damian reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a small black card, and placed it in Eve's hand. "This number, if you ever need me for anything, call." "I don't need." "This isn't a debt," Damian cut in, his voice softer than usual. "This is me wanting to be here for you." Eve looked at him, too stunned to speak. Damian Blackwood, the most powerful underworld tycoon on the East Coast, the man even the FBI feared, and he was saying he wanted to be there for her. Damian brushed his fingers lightly against Eve's cheek, a tenderness that felt almost impossible coming from hands that had ordered lives ended. "Go," Damian said, his voice low. "Become who you deserve to become." Then he turned and walked toward a sleek black car waiting outside. Derek opened the door. Damian stepped in. The door shut. The car pulled away and vanished at the end of the road. Eve stood there watching until it was gone. Then she looked down at the card in her hand. Pure black, only a string of silver numbers, no name, no explanation. She smiled and slipped it carefully into her wallet. Maybe one day. Eve walked through the gates of Harvard Medical School on an autumn day. Yellow leaves scattered thick across the paths. She stood in the middle of the vast campus, tipped her head back to take in the old buildings steeped in history, and felt strangely small. 27 years old, older than most of her classmates by 5 to 7 years. Around her were youthful faces, confident and polished. Students from wealthy families with straight roads that ran from private schools to the Ivy League. And she'd come from hospital corridors at 3 in the morning, a mop in her hand. I heard she used to be cleaning staff. Eve caught the whispers behind her on the first day. Seriously, how'd she even get into Harvard? She must have had someone pull strings. Eve didn't turn around. She didn't explain. She didn't care. 5 years of being dismissed had taught her how to keep walking without needing anyone else's approval. What surprised them was that Eve didn't fall behind. In class, she approached cases from a different angle, more grounded, more intuitive. While her classmates dissected theory, she saw the patient. Ms. Sullivan, a professor called on her during a discussion. Your perspective is unusual. Where did you train before Harvard? In hospitals, Eve answered evenly. Night shift, 5 years watching patients while I mopped floors. The room went quiet. The eyes that had whispered before carried something different now. The professor nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. Sometimes reality teaches more than books. Every week, a fresh bouquet arrived at Eve's dorm. No card, no name, only the most beautiful seasonal flowers. Every late night, her phone would light up with a text from a number she didn't have saved. Have you eaten? Don't stay up too late. Remember to rest. Eve was irritated, and at the same time, she couldn't deny that she missed the person sending them. One evening, she was studying in the library when someone pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. She looked up ready to tell them the seat was taken. Then her heart stopped. Damian Blackwood sat there in a perfectly tailored charcoal gray suit, looking healthy and more dangerous than ever. What are you doing here? Eve asked, her voice catching. Work, Damian said calmly. Harvard isn't your territory, Eve said. Damian smiled, a rare expression that warmed his normally hard face. True, but you are. They left the library and walked across Harvard Yard under a star-filled sky. The autumn wind cut through them, and Eve tightened her coat around herself. Are you watching me? She asked. I protect what matters to me, Damian said, eyes forward. I'm not your property, Eve said, stopping and turning to face him. Damian stopped too. His gray eyes held hers, deeper and more sincere than she'd ever seen. You're right, you're not property. You're the only person who's ever told me no. The only person who isn't afraid of me. The only person who saw me as a human being instead of a boss. Silence stretched between them. Then Damian went on, his voice low and slow as if every word carried weight. I don't know what love is, Evelyn. I've lived 36 years without needing to. But since the night you stood in my room with a syringe in your hand, ready to risk everything to save a stranger, I can't stop thinking about you. I don't know what it is, but it makes me want to be near you, to protect you, to watch you succeed. Eve looked at him, her heart racing for reasons that had nothing to do with fear. Damian, she didn't know what to say. The most powerful underworld tycoon on the East Coast had just confessed his feelings to her. And the scariest part, she felt something too. Something she'd tried to bury since the night he'd held her hand in that hospital room. Eve took a step back and shook her head. Her heart was chaos, but her mind stayed clear. Damian, I need time. Time for what? Damian asked, his gray eyes never leaving her. To know I succeed because of me, Eve said, her voice trembling but firm. Not because of you, not because of your money, not because of anyone else. I need to know I can stand on my own 2 feet before I think about anything else. You think I want to control you. I think you're used to controlling everything, Eve said, holding his gaze. That's how you survived. That's how you succeeded. But I need to know who I am before I know what we are. Damian was quiet for a long time. She braced herself for anger, for disappointment, for him to turn away and never come back. But none of it came. You know, you're the first person who's ever turned me down, Damien said, more thoughtful than furious. I'm not turning you down, Eve said quickly. I'm asking for time. What's the difference? Turning me down is an ending. Time is waiting, Eve said. Damien nodded, and a faint smile touched his mouth. I've waited 36 years to find someone I can trust. I can wait a little longer. Then he turned and walked into the night without looking back. 3 years passed. Eve studied, worked, gave everything she had every day. She threw herself into books, labs, long nights of research. Harvard wasn't easy on anyone, and she had to work twice as hard just to prove she belonged. Damien kept his distance just like he promised, but he was still there in his own way. Every birthday, an anonymous gift arrived. Every exam season, a short message came through. You've got this. Whenever Eve called, rare as it was, Damien was always there. No questions, no demands, just present. Eve changed day by day from the older, shy student into a standout trainee her professors praised. Her thesis in toxicology drew attention, even earned a recommendation for publication in a medical journal. Chloe graduated as an engineer and landed a strong job at a tech company. Her sister was finally standing on her own. Eve wasn't the woman who'd walked into Harvard 3 years earlier. She'd found herself. Damien changed, too. In the news, Blackwood Holdings expanded into legitimate sectors. The charity bearing his name, the Blackwood Foundation, increased its work, funding scholarships for hundreds of students with limited means. Derek stayed in touch with Eve, occasionally offering updates as if she were someone who needed to know. Boss is different now, Derek said during one call. Less cold, more human. Why? Eve asked. You know why, Derek said. Graduation day came. Eve stood on stage and accepted her degree, Doctor of Toxicology, Dr. Evelyn Sullivan. She heard her name echo through the hall and tears spilled down her face. 5 years mopping floors, 3 years at Harvard. Everything had led to this moment. As she stepped down from the stage, her eyes swept the crowd. Chloe was waving, crying hard. Nicole Torres had come up from New York, holding a handmade sign. And farther back, standing apart from everyone else, a familiar figure in a black suit. Damien. He didn't move closer. He didn't want to intrude. He just stood there, watching her from a distance, the way he'd done for 3 years. Still waiting. After 3 years, Eve smiled and walked toward him. This time, she was ready. Eve stood outside the gates of St. Michael's Medical Center, her heart beating bright and fast. The building looked the same. The familiar corridors, the cold fluorescent lights, the sharp, unmistakable bite of disinfectant in the air. But she wasn't the same. 3 years ago, she'd left this place in the pale blue uniform of a cleaning worker. Today, she was back in a spotless white coat, her name embroidered over her chest. Dr. Evelyn Sullivan, toxicology specialist, visiting lecturer. Dr. Sullivan, welcome back. The receptionist in the main lobby smiled as she greeted her. The lecture hall on the 5th floor is ready. Dr. Sullivan. The sound of it was sweeter than anything Eve had ever heard. Sweeter than the chime that signaled the end of a shift after those brutal late nights. Sweeter than the sound of money landing in her account each month. This was the voice of a dream made real. The hall on the 5th floor was packed when Eve walked in. Doctors, nurses, medical students, even administrative staff. All of them had come to hear the story of the woman who'd once mopped floors here, now returning as an expert. Eve stepped up to the podium and looked out over the crowd, and she recognized faces. Nicole Torres sat in the 3rd row, now the head nurse of internal medicine. A few strands of silver threaded through her hair, but her smile still warm the way it had always been. Dr. James Chen sat in the 5th row, now an attending physician in the emergency department, no longer the timid resident he'd once been. And at the very back of the hall, a figure sat quietly in the shadowed corner. Dr. Harrison Blake, retired now, his hair completely white, but his eyes still sharp, the way they'd always been. He'd come, the man who'd thrown her out of an emergency room, who'd called security to drag her away like an intruder. He'd come to listen to her speak. Eve drew a deep breath and began. "Observation doesn't require a degree," she said, her voice carrying through a hall gone silent. "Sometimes the invisible people see the clearest because they aren't bound by expectation. They aren't limited by what they've been taught they're supposed to see. They simply see." She told her story. No hiding, no polishing. The night she'd realized Damien Blackwood was being poisoned with thallium. The times she'd tried to warn people and been brushed aside. The reckless decision to steal a lotion sample in the middle of the night. The moment she'd stood in that emergency room shouting the truth and been thrown out in front of everyone. "I was looked down on," Eve said, her gaze moving from face to face across the room. "I was ignored. I was treated like I didn't exist. And I understand why. I was just cleaning staff. I didn't have a credential. I didn't have permission to speak. I didn't have value in the eyes of the people in white coats." The silence was absolute. "But I had eyes, too," Eve continued. "I had a brain. I had knowledge that life stole my chance to finish. And most importantly, I had a heart that knew a human life mattered more than my own safety." She paused, then looked straight at Blake in the back of the hall. "Talent doesn't wear a uniform. Intelligence doesn't need a degree to exist. It only needs one thing, a chance to shine." Blake nodded slowly with respect. No apology was necessary anymore. That gesture said everything. The entire hall rose to its feet and applauded. Nicole sobbed openly, not bothering to hide it. Chen smiled, pride shining in his eyes. Eve looked down, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "Thank you for giving me a second chance." After the lecture, Eve went up to the rooftop to breathe in clean air. The city of New York stretched out below her, lights glittering in the night. Footsteps sounded behind her. Eve didn't turn around. She didn't need to. "That was a hell of a speech," Damien's voice said, low and familiar. "You heard all of it." "I don't miss anything about you," Damien replied. "I never have." Eve turned. Damien stood there in his familiar black suit under thin moonlight. 3 years. He was still so handsome it stole her breath. Still carried that danger that made other people hesitate. But his gray eyes had changed. Warmer, gentler, more human. "It's been 3 years," Eve said. "I said I'd wait," Damien answered simply. "I used to think I didn't deserve to be loved," Eve whispered. "That I was just a ghost, that I didn't have value beyond taking care of other people. And now. Eve stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth of his body. "Now I'm ready to try." Damien lifted a hand and tilted her face up, looking into her deep blue eyes. "I won't promise I'll be perfect," Damien said, his voice low and honest. "I won't promise my world will be easy. There are shadows you'll have to face. There are dangers you'll have to endure. But I promise you one thing. You won't ever be invisible again." Eve smiled through her tears. Then she rose onto her toes and pressed her mouth to his. They kissed beneath the city lights. The girl who'd once mopped floors and the man who lived in the dark. 2 lonely souls finding light in each other. 6 months later, the Sullivan Foundation officially launched in a ceremony that was simple but filled with meaning. A scholarship fund for people forced to leave school because of circumstance. For talent life had beaten down. For dreams that seemed as if they'd already died. Damien stood backstage, not needing glory, not needing his name mentioned. He simply stood there and watched Eve shine beneath the lights with an unmistakable pride in his eyes. "Talent doesn't have rank," Eve said, her voice carrying across the hall. "Intelligence doesn't wear a uniform, and sometimes the invisible people see the clearest. This foundation isn't mine alone. It belongs to everyone who has ever been dismissed, ignored, or underestimated because of their circumstances." The first scholarship recipient stepped onto the stage. A 24-year-old woman who'd left nursing school in her second year to care for her mother with cancer. Her eyes were red with emotion, her hands trembling as she held the certificate. Eve looked at her and saw herself from 5 years earlier. She saw loss. She saw despair. But she also saw a flame that hadn't gone out. Eve's life was completely different now. She'd become the expert hospitals across the country called when they faced baffling poisonings no one could solve. She taught. She researched. And she never forgot to meet the eyes of the cleaning staff when she walked hospital corridors. Damien still ran his empire, but now Eve stood beside him. They weren't perfect. A doctor and a man of shadows, two worlds that couldn't be more different. But they fit each other because they both understood betrayal, and what it meant to rise from ash, and how to find light inside the dark. "Sis, I got promoted," Chloe called, her voice bright with childlike joy. "I'm proud of you," Eve smiled. "No," Chloe said. "I'm proud of you. You're the reason I didn't quit. On the hardest days, I watched you work 2 jobs in a single day and never complain once. I told myself I didn't have the right to fall apart while you were still standing." "We're both each other's reason," Eve said, tears sliding down her cheeks. The phone rang. "Dr. Sullivan, this is Boston Hospital. We have a mysterious poisoning case. 8 doctors can't find the cause. The patient is getting worse every day. We need your help." Eve set her coffee down and smiled. Damien watched her from across the breakfast table, gray eyes already used to this scene. "Another case," Eve said. "Always," Damien said, rising to kiss her forehead. "Go, save one more life. I'll be here when you get back." Eve looked into the mirror before she left. No more faded pale blue uniform. No more exhausted eyes of an invisible woman. No more ghost drifting through hallways no one bothered to see. Just her. Dr. Evelyn Sullivan. The woman who'd proven that light could come from the deepest dark. She lifted the phone, her voice steady with confidence. "This is Dr. Sullivan. I'm on my way."